Welcome to the screencast for Free Will by Thomas Nagel and Free Will and Determinism by W.T. Stace. The first article by Thomas Nagel starts on page 181 in our textbook. So Thomas Nagel is the same author that wrote the article that we read, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And now we're going to take a look at a piece of work of his that talks about what it means to have free will. He asks us to imagine that we are in line in a cafeteria and we get to the desserts. And there's a healthy option, which is fruit, a peach, and there's also a slice of cake that we could get. We happen to really want the piece of cake, so we take it and we eat it. And later on, we think, well, I should have had the healthier option instead. You might think to yourself, I could have had a peach instead. And that thought right there, when you look back on your prior actions and you think that you could have done otherwise, that is at the heart of what we mean when we talk about free will. The fact that we could have done otherwise in some situation or other. So, if you think that you could have done something in the past that you chose not to do, it implies that in that very moment, your choice, your particular choice as a person, your consciousness, yourself, your ego, however you want to think about it, that was the deciding factor in what actually happened. And when it goes on into the future, that will be the deciding factor in the choices you make. And if somebody says to you, well, are you sure? Because if you rewound time and everything was exactly the same, wouldn't you just make the same choice again? You might defend yourself by saying, well, there have been similar situations in which I did make the other choice. I made the healthy choice, but just not this time. But Nagel thinks that's not enough. Because again, if you rewound time to that exact moment, all of the same forces are going to be at play. You're going to have the same exact overwhelming desire to choose the cake for whatever reason. Your physiology, your habits, your genes, you had a bad day, whatever it is, they will be exactly the same as they were. So what exactly would lead you to choosing the fruit instead of the cake? Why do we ever choose what it is that we choose? We only apply this idea of could have done differently or will do differently in the future to humans and maybe a couple of other species of animal. Nagel wants you to think about an object instead. We use the words could have about objects, but we still need agency. So if we say something like, that car could make it to the top of the hill, we don't mean it could do it on its own force of will. We mean that a person would have to get inside, start the car, and drive it up there. All agency means is that you are an agent in the world. You can make a difference by your will and your desires and your actions. That's what it means to be an agent in a system. So when you say that there's a choice, you mean that there is an open possibility before the decision is made. So in the simplest case, there are two options. And when you have to choose between those options, having a choice means you could pick either one until the very moment that you choose. Now, is it the case for real that in any choice instance, we don't even have to think about all of them, in any choice instance, it's really an open possibility that you could choose either one? Nagel points out the fact that some things are predetermined, our choices are limited. And one of the most fundamental limiting factors are the laws of physics. All bodies in space and time are subject to the laws of physics. If you throw something off of a roof, it's going to fall to the ground. If nothing fantastically different happens, the sun will rise tomorrow. So our choices are already limited by physical things. They are, in the language of free will, predetermined or determined. And of course, we as people are in space and time, so we are limited by the laws of physics. Those are external factors, however. It is well within the laws of physics for you to pick up a piece of fruit and eat it instead of picking up a slice of cake and eating it. So if nothing external stops you, the possibility seems like it's open that we could have chosen the fruit instead of the cake. But you got to remember that when you chose the cake, you wanted it, for whatever reasons. And again, if you rewound time, you would still want it. Could you have overcome that desire? Determinists say no. And determinists don't mean there's just a little tiny bit of free will or some leeway or bit of choice that you can make. Determinists think that every single event that happens and has happened since the beginning of time is already pre-programmed into the universe. So I have the little graphic on the left of the Big Bang, and you can see how on this model, first subatomic particles formed, and then elements, and then atoms and molecules, all the way up to stars and galaxies and DNA and us. So we are part of this vast chain of causality. We're going back to this causal thinking, where we can't really come up with anything when we try and say something could have happened without a cause. Every single thing that we know of in our physical universe is the result of a cause and effect, causal thinking. And determinists say that the universe is like clockwork. It's like gears in a factory. One thing happens, it causes something else, and sometimes those events can be really, really complex, but they all still have causes. So the determinists, and you would say these are hard determinists who think there is absolutely nothing free about the entire universe, would say that your desire to choose the cake came from your genetics, your upbringing, your habits, your mood at the moment. They all add up to that moment where you picked up the cake, and there's no possibility that you can escape those and pick the fruit instead. It just seemed like it. It was an illusion that you had a choice. Now, of course, this has drastic consequences for morality, because if nobody could have done otherwise, how can we possibly blame someone for committing a crime? They were programmed to, both internally and externally. The little thing I have over here is people studying business and how to affect consumer behavior, but it's also a handy reference of a lot of different things that are going to contribute to whatever your decisions and desires and beliefs are inside your head. He gives an example of someone stealing something from your house when you throw a party. And you might get angry at them. You thought they were your friend. But really, if they were programmed to do it, how can you blame them? Now, Nagel nods to quantum mechanics for a possible out. Because, of course, when we say things like a clockwork universe, we're thinking of familiar space and familiar time. You have to be careful, though, because when people who aren't experts in physics reference physics, it's not always a straight line of comparison. But his point, he's aware of that, and his point is that there's some kind of physical possibility that the actual physical universe might not be 100% clockwork determined. But even if you discount that, he doesn't think that what we normally mean by free will even comes into play yet. Because we don't really mean that our personality and our psychologies and our upbringing and our habits are contributing to our decision when we say we want free will. When we want free will, we want a truly free self that surveys the possibilities and picks one. So that is free will in the broadest sense. There's some entity inside of us that, regardless of all of the causes, can somehow separate itself and make a choice. But Nagel thinks that if we look at that a little bit more deeply, it doesn't make any logical or rational sense. Because if it's a truly free choice, unhindered by absolutely any causes, then it's hard to see what this self is or how it would possibly make a decision without any information. It would just be true randomness. It doesn't seem like it's possible for anything to really happen without any cause. So I took the upper little picture up there from the internet, but you can see my skills at Microsoft Paint in the bottom left. If you had a truly free self, it would have to look something like this. We know we have physical causes because we have physical bodies and we're in the world. We know we have internal causes because we have desires and dreams and beliefs. But if we had a truly free self, none of those could really influence it. And it's unclear what makes the decision in that case. So Nagel doesn't think that free will can actually make sense in that broadest sense. And it still poses a problem for morality because of that. Here's a long quote from page 185. Nagel says, "Up to now it seemed like determinism is the biggest threat to responsibility. But now it seems that even if our choices are not determined in advance, it's hard to understand in what way we can do what we don't do. Either of two choices may be possible in advance, but unless I determine which one of them occurs, it's no more my responsibility than when it was determined by things outside of my control. And how can I determine it if nothing determines it?" So on the two ends of the spectrum, absolute free will untethered by all causes, and absolute determinism, which means there's absolutely no choice whatsoever. It doesn't seem like you can have moral responsibility at all. Now I have two pictures here on the left because of another story that's meant to illustrate the different views of free will. So imagine that someone's driving along and they cause a car wreck, and it's determined later that the driver who caused the wreck has epilepsy and it was an epileptic fit that caused them to lose control of the car. Most people wouldn't say that that person has moral responsibility for causing the crash. They might say they have physical responsibility, but you wouldn't blame someone for their biology going haywire. But then you'd think if they knew they had epilepsy and they decided not to take their medication, that changes. However, if they were programmed biologically, just like the epilepsy programs them, then how can they be morally responsible? So that's determinism. But if the person knew they were epileptic and decided to get into the car, but couldn't be connected to any of the causes, which would be, hey, I know I have epilepsy and I know I missed my medication. If you have truly free will, you can't be connected to the causes. So how could your decision make you morally responsible if you can't be connected to the causes? Now, the middle ground between these two, that a lot of people purport as their own vision of what free will is saying that, okay, maybe physical determinism is true, and maybe internal determinism is true. But when I say free will, I mean I'm externally free to act on my desires. Nobody's stopping me. Nobody's putting me in chains. People who believe this are sometimes called compatibilists. We'll talk about that definition in a little bit. So if someone forces you to take the cake or shoves it in your face, you're not free. But if your desire tells you that you want the cake and nobody stops you, you are free. You have that free will to go and eat the cake. We will always be subject to our personalities, genetics, beliefs, and desires. But because we have them inside of us, because they're our desires, that's what makes us morally responsible for our choices. Nagel finds this unacceptable. He says that if you're always beholden to your psychological factors and your current situation, you're trapped. You don't have real agency. But he acknowledges at the very end of the article that it's really hard to say what this self could be that could step outside even a little bit of our prior determining causes. Now, Stace, who has the next article, which starts on page 186, and it's only about 2 pages long, is the person that defends this middle way and says it's the only thing we could ever mean when we talk about free will. He points to everyday life when we ask someone what they want for dinner, or we ask our children if they want to play an instrument or join a sports team. We can only ask those sorts of questions if we implicitly already believe in free will, because otherwise we wouldn't bother. He also gives an example, a little bit like the epilepsy car example on page 187, when he talks about a court case, when the judge asked if someone who signed a confession did it of their own free will. And the prisoner says, "No, I was coerced by the police. They beat me up." Stace thinks that the philosopher who truly is a determinist and doesn't believe in any kind of free will at all would have to say that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you were coerced or not. It doesn't matter if you knew you had epilepsy or not. No one has free will. So no one can be responsible. My dog doesn't have free will. I'm sorry about that, but we're almost done. So he says that all that matters is that there are internal factors and external factors. He says on page 188, acts freely done are those whose immediate causes are psychological states in the agent. Acts not freely done are those whose immediate causes are states of affairs external to the agent. So he's this middle ground compatibilist. You can see in the little diagram I have here, if you think determinism is true and you think we have free will, you think free will and determinism are compatible in this way. If you believe in determinism is true, but free will is false, you're a hard determinist who thinks there's no such thing as free will. And the way to argue against Stace is to be a libertarian about free will. And that's to deny that there is physical determinism. So we go think back to the quantum realm, and you don't even have to buy into the idea that that's the reason why we have free will. You just might think that we don't understand the universe well enough to fully explain cause and effect.